All right, hey, welcome to chapter 3. I think of the 3 chapters here in this first unit. I'm going to turn this light off so I don't have a halo. I don't know if that's going to help any. Helps a little bit. All right, hey, so welcome to chapter 3. I think of the 3 chapters in this first unit, this is the most difficult to wrap your head around, mostly because it's dealing with a very specific topic. And so we're looking at federalism in chapter 3. While the other ones are more, obviously you're dealing with the Constitution and those types of things, or the role of government, which is difficult, but like this is actually getting into the weeds, so to speak. And so federalism is just this idea where you have 2 levels of government that are operating in unison with each other or totally independent of each other. And I pulled that definition there on the screen out of the textbook. But in America, in the United States, you're looking at the federal government out of Washington, D.C., and it handles laws and whatnot, regulations that deal with the whole country, right? And it uses the powers that are given to it by the Constitution to do that. And then you have state governments, you have local governments that also make laws and regulate things within their area of jurisdiction. Okay, so that's really what you're looking at, is this idea of jurisdiction. Who has the right to rule in certain areas? The problem is, though, it's not always super clear, right? It's not always super clear because it's not always clear cut. It's not always the federal government's job or the state government's job. Sometimes it's both. In a couple of instances, it's probably neither, but that's a little bit further than that's a little deeper than we're going to go here. Okay, so in the United States, the federal government is responsible for the nations as a whole, and the state is within its borders, right? And so we're just going to define it as that. But there's also local governments. Just be aware of that. And so, I mean, federalism can trickle down to as far as like local school boards, right? Or you have federal monies that come to schools in states, and then school boards, and then states make rules, and then school boards make rules for individual schools, and then principals or whatever have to make rules for that school. So I mean, all those are under that same umbrella. They're all just operating together. Okay, so one of the characteristics are that the federal and state governments work together. Another characteristic of federalism, at least in the United States, is that we have a written constitution, and that constitution can't be changed without the consent of the states. And so the federal government can't get more power via the constitution without the consent of the states agreeing to this. There's legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government, and they all have some degree of anonymity or autonomy, I guess. But they also have checks and balances over each other, and there's the legislature on the federal level is Congress. We also have the state level in Topeka, and you have the state house in Topeka. You have the state senate in Topeka. You have the state courts. You have city courts. You also have federal courts. Then you have executive with the president in Washington D.C. and then the governor in Topeka. In our case here in Kansas. Okay, there's independence between the federal and the state, but there also has to be some cooperation, and the courts have to be used to settle these disputes, and that's one of the main characteristics of federalism. Courts are used to settle disputes between the federal and state level, and between states. Those are two of the defined roles of the Supreme Court, is that they get original jurisdiction if a state sues the federal government or if a state sues another state. And so, like if you have disputes over water rights or let's just use water rights as our example. Let's say like Colorado dams up the Arkansas River and prevents water from flowing into the state of Kansas. Well, then Kansas would probably sue Colorado, and then that would go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would hear that case. Boom. All right. State governments are always represented in the upper house of the national legislature. So the Senate, we have equal representation. So a big state like California only has 2 senators, where a relatively small state like Kansas only has 2 senators as well. And so in the Senate, California is represented just as much as Kansas, and you need the Senate to make any changes to federal statutes, or to bring a change to the Constitution, which would alter federalism. Federalism is seen as a changing relationship between the federal government and the states. Over the history of our country, the state governments have lost power. I don't see how that you could objectively look at it any other way. I mean, obviously, you look at the Articles of Confederation, states probably had too much power. And so those states are going to be regulated for the betterment of the nation with the Constitution. And from that standpoint, or from that point forward, the federal government is just kind of chipped away at state autonomy over and over again. You look at the United States versus Wrightwood Dairy Company, 1940. The federal government can regulate commercial activities that occur within states. That's because the government has the right to regulate interstate commerce. Well, what makes it interstate commerce? Does one piece of that supply chain come from another state? Does that all of a sudden does that make the operation interstate? Do all the parts of a economic venture have to originate within the state's border for that to be intrastate instead of interstate? And again, who decides that? It's the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court or the court systems decide, where those rules are. All right. Enactment power is laid out in Article 1, Section 8, and it defines the legal boundaries of the federal government. Basically, it gives the government, these are the express powers. These are national foreign affairs. So things are going to affect all of the country. Treaties with other countries, they're going to provide for the general welfare. And that's a big one that's kind of gray. What's the general welfare, right? They can tax, they can borrow money, they can regulate interstate commerce, they can regulate foreign commerce, they can protect property rights, they can provide common defense, they can raise and support an army, they can declare war, they can coin money, they can, you have naturalization process. So who is a citizen, who is not a citizen, and postal service are all express powers laid out in the Constitution. Now, in that same section, you have the Elastic Clause, which gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out these express powers. And so sometimes it's called the Elastic Clause, sometimes it's called the necessary and proper clause. And basically, it's just like, I don't know. Okay, so let's say like, if we're going to collect taxes, the government probably needs to have an organization that collects taxes. So you have the IRS. One of the early struggles of the nation was the national bank. And so early Federalists wanted the national bank to house money and to loan money. And so they went to Congress a couple times, or the Supreme Court a couple times over this issue. And the Supreme Court ruled that because of this Elastic Clause, the United States government had the right to establish a bank because they could coin money, right? Or borrow money. So if you're going to borrow money or make money, you're going to have a place for money to stay. Okay, and then you also have the Commerce Clause, which allows us to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with Indian tribes. And this Commerce Clause is actually, I mean, it's kind of like you read that and you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. That's really simple. But this is really expanded over time. Like, what is commerce? What is it just physical goods? Is it ideas? Is it information? Is it data? Is it customer information, customer data? And can the government regulate all of that? Okay. There we go. Okay. And so then we get into federalism and the Constitution. So the rights of individual states. are not listed anywhere in the Constitution. Obviously, the express powers of Congress are laid out, what they can do, and it's just assumed whatever Congress cannot do belongs to the states, and this is called the reserve powers. Okay, so you have powers that are expressed to the federal government, you have powers that are expressed or reserved to the state, and then you have concurrent powers, which are powers that are shared between federal and state governments. And those are things like taxation, borrowing money. States can borrow money. They can establish courts. They can make and enforce laws. They can charter banks. They can regulate corporations. And so all of those things fall into the powers of state and federal government. So you have some overlap there between those things. Here we go. States are not allowed to deny citizenship because naturalization is one of the express powers of the federal government. Citizens are promised due process of law, and that's in the 5th Amendment and then also the 14th Amendment. Equal protection is there as well. And you can't, and states cannot deny voting rights based on race or gender, and those are laid out within amendments in the Constitution, the 15th and the 18th, 20th, 15th, and the women's right to vote. Okay, so both state and federal governments cannot suspend writs of habeas corpus, which basically means you can't hold somebody in jail without accusing them of a crime. You can't hold somebody indefinitely. You can't pass a bill of attainder. Which means you can't declare somebody guilty without a trial, and you can't put a law into effect ex post facto law, which makes a act criminalized retroactively. So if you pass a law today that says you can't teach an online class, I can't be charged. I could be charged moving forward after today for continuing to teach this class, but they couldn't put me in jail from teaching it in the past. Okay, we also have the supremacy clause, which means that the federal government or federal laws are the supreme law, are the supreme laws. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so if federal laws and state laws conflict, then federal laws win. And there's some gray area there because of the reserve powers of states. But to be honest, I mean, I don't see a situation in which states are going to be victorious in the court system with a law that challenges federal law. You look at, like, I think the book may have used this example with the marijuana laws. You know, Colorado has a law that legalizes medical and recreational cannabis within their state, but that drug or that plant is still considered illegal by the United States. So the United States could definitely go in and shut all those dispensaries down if they wanted to with the DEA. The other thing that they ran into when states start to do this is banking. They can't take pot money to federally insured banks because the federal government would seize that money. And so a lot of the dispensaries ran into problems of where they're going to put their money, where they're going to store their money. And to be honest, I don't even know if they figured that out yet. Like, there's so much cash to be made that it has to be held someplace, but where, right? You also have the full faith and credit clause, which requires states to accept court decisions and public acts and contracts from other states. And so you get into that. That's when one state passed the right for same-sex couples to be married, and then because of the full faith and credit clause, those marriage certificates should transfer to other places. And we end up having to have a Supreme Court case over that, which is U.S. versus Windsor, which strikes down the denial of federal benefits for same-sex couples. And then we have the Bear versus Lewin in Hawaii, and then the conservative government passes the Defense of Marriage Act, which liberal Bill Clinton signs, right? But then that bill is declared unconstitutional by the federal government. Okay, so book talks a little bit about the Supreme Court case where the national banks are approved, and then you have Giddens versus Odin, which lets the Supreme Court have the sole power to regulate interstate commerce, which is really kind of interesting because it's a case about steamboats, and you wouldn't think that necessarily like steamboats would make a interesting Supreme Court case, but it really does, and I'm going to probably have a link up for those court cases for you to read through and decide if that's something you want to look into a little bit more. States start to try to push back on the growing federal power during the administration of Andrew Jackson. And they come up with this idea of the Nullification Act. I think Virginia and Kentucky had an idea like this early on in the country, and it never really took hold. But during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, South Carolina is subject to some tariffs that they don't feel are fair, that they feel like are aimed at the South. And so they passed this Nullification Act, which they argue would allow them to not take part in a federal tariff of goods coming in from overseas and allow them to export stuff with foreign countries without the support or regulation of the United States government. And Jackson threatens basically to send in military troops. There was some talk of secession, and then the tariff gets lowered and it works itself out. Another court case is Dred Scott, which is the famous slavery case where you have a slave that gets moved around quite a bit, and he moves into free territory and gets left behind by his owners. And he argues that when he was abandoned, or even when he moved into free territory, that he was no longer a slave. And of course, in the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans were not citizens, and that the national government lacked the authority to ban slavery in new territory. So the government couldn't pass compromises like the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise gets overridden by the Dred Scott case. The 14th Amendment has to be passed to overrule the Dred Scott case, which is kind of interesting because it does show that there's ways around Supreme Court rulings, that if the Supreme Court rules one way and the people don't agree with that, they can pass a new constitutional amendment and change the law to better reflect the wills of the people. Okay. Book talks about, since the Civil War, the role of the federal government has grown, and we've talked about that quite a bit. And then we're going to talk briefly about the three different types of federalism. You have dual federalism, and this is typically the federalism that's seen from the end of the Civil War to the period of the Gilded Age, which is roughly, let's just say 1900. But it could extend both ways, probably 20 years, 20 to 30 years, no problem. And so this is more of the federal government and the state governments having distinct spheres of jurisdiction. They have clear-cut lines of where federal power ends and where state power begins. And the book talks about it as a layer cake. So you cut a layer cake in half, and you can look at the layers, and you have you have the white cake, and then you have the chocolate cake, and you have the white cake and the chocolate cake, and those layers are clearly defined. And so after the Gilded Age, which was a period in which large business began to control aspects of the American society in such a way that the common people and the government felt they had too much power, you start to see a shift in this idea of dual federalism, and you come up with this idea of cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism, probably the best examples of this are during the Great Depression, or even during the struggle for civil rights, in which the federal government and state governments work together to install laws and regulations for the betterment of everybody. And this is the type of federalism that's used from the 30s into the 70s. And the book talks about this idea of being a marble cake. You cut up a marble cake and it's more swirled, it's not layered, right? And so you have areas where the chocolate is much darker than they have areas of dark chocolate there where, let's say the federal government is dark chocolate, so that's just federal there, but then like there's some gray area in between the chocolate and the light. And so you can look at the court cases like National Labor Relations Board versus Jones, or the Great Society programs from Lyndon Johnson, like Medicaid, Medicare, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, that were on the state, on the national level, and then they're applied to the state level as well. I guess you could probably look at this also with cooperative federalism, with like, well, obviously with like Brown versus School Board in the 50s, and the deregulation of schools, and think of it as, or the desegregation of schools. Think of like Little Rock, Arkansas, where the 101st Airborne was called in to enforce a Supreme Court, a federal ruling or a federal law. And states were reluctant to do so. And so when states were reluctant to do so, the federal government had to step in and make sure that those things happened. And then after the 70s, typically after 68 is when Richard Nixon comes in. So Richard Nixon comes in 1968, and you start to see this idea of new federalism, in which the book calls this the decentralization of policies, where you're taking programs away from the federal government and you're giving them back to the states. And so Nixon and President Reagan were seen as leading with what's referred to as the devolution revolution, where we're devolving federal programs from the federal level to the state level. And we're going to allow states to put these programs into place. We got a couple court cases that kind of show, that actually kind of show the opposite. And so again, it's not clear cut. Like, yeah, a lot of times we talk about like, Republicans are trying to deregulate government, but then when you actually sit down and look at some of the policies that Republican governments have put in place, actually increase a lot of regulations across different spheres. And Democrats deregulate sometimes, and Democrats also regulate, and Republicans deregulate. It's not, there's no right and wrong clear answer for anything. It's all situational. And so you look at the United States versus Lopez, and the Supreme Court strikes down the possession of gun laws, regulating basically that because of interstate commerce, the federal government can regulate when and where you can have a gun. Following 9/11, you start to see the federal government start to take more and more power back. You see the Department of Homeland Security operate pretty freely within states. You see the No Child Left Behind education initiative put forward by the Bush family, right? And then finally, the Affordable Care Act, which is Obamacare, really puts the government in the healthcare business. Let's just say that. And so you see that, and all of those things are taking power away from states. Grants, the book talks a lot about grants, about how typically how states get their money. We talk about a couple of different types of grants. The first one is categorical grants, and these are very specific grants. I'm going to give you $20 to go see the new Ghostbuster movie, right? I'm giving you this money, telling you exactly what to spend it on, and you're going to see it at 7 o'clock, and you're going to go to the theater downtown in Hutchinson, right? And so it's there's not a theater downtown in Hutchinson, by the way, but all right, so you have those. It's telling you exactly where to go and how to spend that money. I'm going to give you $14 million to spend on early education for underprivileged children, for families that make less than $25,000 a year. Categorical grants. Categorical grants are relatively popular, although nobody likes them. the government likes them, but it creates a lot of red tape. It creates a lot of governmental jobs and a lot of regulations. And so people will always argue for block grants because block grants are less stringent. They're basically like, here's $25,000 or $25 million or whatever number you want to use. And you spend that on education however you see fit. And so there's no outline of how you're going to use a block grant other than, all right, this is for education, or this is for roads, or these are for infrastructure projects or whatever. And so in the 60s and 70s, you see the increase of block grants. But then by the end of the 1970s, it comes about that, you know what, if I give people a bunch of money and I don't tell them what to do with it, they don't always do what I want them to do with it. And so the use of block grants has decreased over modern times. And the book talks about some of the reasons is that politicians can't claim victories for block grants. Like if I'm running for Senate and I gave the state of Kansas a huge block grant, and the state of Kansas did something that I didn't spell out in that grant, I really can't claim a victory for that. There's greater control and categorical grants, and that allows politicians to take more credit and to control the flow of money. And typically categorical grants take a lot of money to put in place and to meet regulations and those types of things. And so there's a lot of work to put those in place, and they're going to stick around for a lot longer. Two relatively new ideas are unfunded mandates, in which the federal government basically creates a regulation that states have to meet. And if they don't meet that, then states are going to miss out on some type of a grant, or they're going to miss out on some type of a compensation. And then you also have cross-cutting mandates, which basically you take the threat of either legal penalties or loss of grants tied to something else. So like I think the book talks about, I know the book talks about Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, right? And so you have Mothers Against Drunk Drivers that try to get drunk driving laws passed on the state levels, and they're unsuccessful. And so then they go to the federal level, and they're not necessarily successful with all of their goals, but one of their goals was to raise the drinking age from 18 to 21. And so when the federal government ties the drinking age into this cross-cutting mandate, they basically regulated states by saying, look, if your drinking age is not 21, then you're not going to be eligible for federal highway money. And so if you can't get this highway money if you sell alcohol to people under the age of 21, because the drinking age used to be 18. And so I think all the states except for one, which was Louisiana for a long time, raised their age to 21 because the federal highway, the money that the federal government was giving out was more valuable than the revenue that was produced by kids from 18 to 21 drinking. And so those kids down in Louisiana must have been getting after it if they could lower the or slow down the raising of the mandate. So you have coercive federalism, which the book talks about. Basically, the government uses the stick of mandates versus the carrots of grants. So look, either you do this, or I'm gonna, you know, you can either raise your drinking age, or I'm going to, you know, cut federal money, right? And so that creates this confrontational interaction between federal and state governments on different ideas. I don't know, I'm trying to come, let's say like the federal government requires states to produce 50% of their energy through renewable energy products by 2075, right? And so, or they're going to lose, you know, something along the way. And so state governments might, some might be in favor of that, and some might be opposed to it. And then you're going to create some kind of like a fight between federal and state governments. Talks about immigration and how states are starting to play more of an important role in immigration. Although naturalization and immigration are typically an expressed However, for federal government, states see the effects of immigrants and immigration on their states, and so they're starting to get involved. And I think that's something that's going to play out in your lifetime. This is a legal question. How much control do states have over the immigration process, over people that are undocumented in the country? Can they protect undocumented workers within their state from the federal government? If the federal government doesn't know that undocumented workers are in the state, but the state does, is the state required to inform the federal government? And so that will be interesting to see how that plays out in the court system within probably the next 10 to 15 years. You have the Defense of Marriage Act, which we kind of talked about a little bit. And you can read about that, the role that the courts played in bringing about the equality of marriage. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, the book talks about strategies and venue shopping, and how MAD, which was a pretty big organization when I was growing up, it's still a pretty powerful organization. It's just not as it's not as out and in your face as it used to be. But also, I think drunk driving, for the most part, has declined quite a bit. And so MAD was out, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers was out in states, and they're trying to piecemeal legislation together in individual states, and they were struggling. And so they turned their attention to Congress, and we talked about that. They passed that minimum drinking age act. They're always pushing for drunk driving to become a felony. And it's difficult to get that type of legislation passed through Congress, mostly because somebody in Congress always gets popped for drunk driving. At least if not every term, every other term, you're going to see. Well, I'll go on a limb and say every term that there's either a federal member of Congress or a state member of a state house that gets arrested for drunk driving during a session of their legal year. And so that's something they're not willing to regulate against themselves. Venue shopping talks about this, like where you put your attention. Do you focus on the national level? Do you focus on the state level? Anti-abortion advocates are starting to focus more on the state levels and pass laws through. And of course, and we just saw the Supreme Court case in Texas that went through, like the new heartbeat laws, or that individuals can sue providers even if they're not actually a patient. And so California has threatened to use the same type of legislation to enforce gun control. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Like if I'm able to sue a doctor that performs abortions, even though I'm not affected, in California, am I able to sue a gun manufacturer for somebody taking another person's life with a firearm? And we'll see how that works out. Advantages of federalism: states can be laboratories of democracy. We see that with the abortion law in Texas. We see that with the marijuana laws across the nation. People, take into consideration, is it good, is it bad? Levels of government can take action and work towards the same thing on different levels. You have a system of checks and balances between the states and the federal government, and you have a diverse opinion of public opinion in the United States. I mean, the opinion of somebody in Northeast Maine is going to be different than somebody in Southwest California, Southern California, and San Diego. And so local governments probably need to be involved in those types of things. The drawback is that states compete against each other for businesses, and so they lower tax regulations and revenues. And then you see unequal state incomes and education spending. And so living in Mississippi is going to be different. You're going to have a different relationship with money from the state government and the federal government than, let's say, like if you live in New York or if you live in Oregon or someplace like that. And so you're going to have some inequalities that way. So hopefully that answers some questions about federalism. That's going to end our first unit. You have multiple choice tests that's going to be up shortly, if it's not already up by the time you watch this video. And use your book, use these notes, and do your best on that. And let me know if you have any questions. I will see you with chapter 4, where we start talking about civil liberties and civil rights. Peace.